Ring Talk. It's Rob Port, your host. We got another great show for you. Coming up a little bit later in the program, Measure 1 still being debated down in Bismarck, or the implementation of Measure 1. We've talked a lot about it on the podcast, and I've talked a lot about how I feel this measure is unconstitutional. I don't think it's good policy. Later in the program, we'll be talking with Allan Dickerson. He is an attorney from a group called the Institute for the Freedom of Speech. He's going to be on their group, actually in conjunction. And their group is, I think, would fairly be described as sort of a right-leaning group. The founder is a Republican. But they, last week, released a statement, really in conjunction with the ACLU, which I think most people perceive as being a left-leaning group. Both of them, sort of condemning Measure 1 and, the debate over implementing it down in Bismarck. Anyway, we'll talk more about that in the program later in the show. But what I want to talk about now is the idea of freedom of speech. Because a lot of times when we talk about freedom of speech, we think of it in the context of the First Amendment. And of course, what the First Amendment means as law is a restriction on Congress, or more broadly, the government, taking action against your ability to express yourself. So this would be something along the lines of Congress passing a law, saying that you can't talk about a certain subject, or Congress passing a law saying that you have to pay a tax to express yourself. That's how we think of the First Amendment, that it's a restriction on the government. In the area of free speech, what doesn't a lot of times get as much attention is the problem of society essentially censoring itself, or a majority faction, or not even a majority faction, but let's just say a very vocal, very outspoken, very activist faction of society silencing other factions. And the thing is it's here. What interests me, I remember when President Trump got elected, there was a big surge in sales for the book Fahrenheit 451, written by Ray Bradbury, one of my favorite books of all time. I think what a lot of people forget about that book, right? Because the reason why so many people were buying it was this assumption that President Trump was going to come into office and he was going to use the awesome powers of the presidency and the federal government to start trying to silence people. And so I think a lot of people were buying the Ray Bradbury book as a way to sort of virtue signal their opposition to that sort of thing. And I don't mean to say virtue signal derisively. I have no patience at all for government interference with free speech. Certainly, I think some of the concerns about President Trump are overwrought. But to the extent that he may try to silence people, he shouldn't. But the thing is, if you actually read Fahrenheit 451, the people who commenced the book burning, it wasn't the government, it was popular society, it was people in general. The people were censoring themselves. And that's what I thought about recently when I read a story in the New York Times. The headline is, YA author, YA means young adult. It's, if you're not familiar with the term, it's a genre of fiction these days. Think books like The Hunger Games. YA author pulls her debut after pre-publication accusations of racism. The book was to be called Blood Heir. It's by a young woman by the name of Amelie, it's Amelie Wen Zhao, and I apologize if I'm butchering that name. I'm not very good at pronouncing names. Anyway, it was a book. It was sort of about a mythical kingdom, and I haven't read the book. Obviously, it hasn't been published, so I don't really know a whole lot about it. But from what I gather, essentially, it was to be about this kingdom, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and one of the elements is slavery. And so people upset about it are saying that because she wrote about slavery, not in the context of how Americans typically feel about slavery, that she was being racist. Now, when I say that, obviously the American story of slavery specifically is about black slavery, right? It's about African-American people, dark-colored skin, brought from Africa and other places, frankly, but predominantly Africa, brought to the United States and used as slave labor, bred as slave labor. sold as slave labor. It was a black mark on our nation's history. It's the ramifications of which we are still living with today. It's an ugly, ugly history. But this author, who is an Asian American, she was a first-generation American. She came to America. She lived part of her life overseas, and then she came to the United States of America. And, she's being attacked because some of the people in her book were not... The slavery wasn't connotated as white people owning dark-skinned slaves. And so some of the slaves in her book are white slaves, and the people opposed to her book were offended by that. They called it, some of the reviewers, people who got early reviews of the book but prior to publish, were calling it racist trash. They were calling it retrograde. They were calling it offensive. And the backlash got so severe that the author herself last week posted a statement, and she said this: to the book community, I want to start by saying that I have the utmost respect for your voices, and I am listening. I am grateful to those who have raised questions around representation, coding, and themes in my book. I immigrated from China when I was 18, drawing on my own multicultural upbringing and the complex history of my heritage that has incidences of bias and oppression. I wrote Blood Heir from my immediate cultural perspective. The issues around affinity, indenturement, and in the story represent a specific critique of the epidemic of indentured labor and human trafficking prevalent in many industries across Asia, including in my own home country. The narrative and history of slavery in the United States is not something I can, would, or intended to write, but I recognize that I am not in merely my own cultural context. I am sorry for the pain this has caused. It was never my intention to bring harm to any reader of this valued community, particularly those for whom I seek to write and empower. As such, I have decided to ask my publisher not to publish Blood Heir at this time, and they have agreed. I don't wish to clarify, defend, or have anyone defend me. This is not that. This is an apology. With the feedback of the community, I feel like this is the right decision. So essentially, she gets bullied so badly because of her book, and people assuming that because her book doesn't present, a version of slavery that Americans perhaps are most familiar with because it's a part of our history, that somehow she's being racist towards African Americans. She's talking about slavery that goes on today. Slavery throughout the ages, the American history of slavery is not the only history of slavery. I mean, the Romans enslaved people. The Romans enslaved other Europeans. I mean, there's been slavery throughout history. Just about every culture had slavery of one form or another in their past, some of them in their present, as the author alludes to. It's an ugly, ugly thing. But what I don't understand is this mob of people formed. They didn't like something that was in a book, and the end result is the book's now not being published. And that's not the government, but bringing this full circle back to the point I started out talking about. This is not the government doing this. This is not some committee of Congress getting together and saying that book should not be published, right? This isn't some town library. This isn't some citizens council getting together. This is a mob of people suppressing the publication of a book. Now listen, throughout the ages, there's lots of books that are ugly, that have hateful things in it. I could go down to my public library right now and check out Mein Kampf, written by Adolf Hitler. As a matter of fact, I was just in my library earlier today. The book's there, sitting on the shelf. And you know what? Should be. It should be there. Because books shouldn't be banned. But that's exactly what's going on here. The book is being banned. And again, when I say that, when we think about banning books, what we think about is the government banning books. What we think about is some politician getting up on their high horse and passing a law or passing a bill or using some sort of regulatory maneuver to stop some form of speech or to stop a book. But here, it's us. It's the public. We're doing this to ourselves. And this, to me, is although it's not usually the way we think of censorship, it's not usually the way we think of banning books, to me is more dangerous than the government doing it. Right? It's one thing for the government to do it, but for these moral busybodies, as C.S. Lewis once called them, these moral busybodies, their cupidity is upheld by the power they have in being a mob. Now, let me bring this back around to another one of my hobby horses. People who read my writing, people who listen to this podcast are aware of the fact that I do not like the initiated measure process. As a matter of fact, I don't like populism in general. My distaste for populism is why, frankly, as a Republican, as a conservative, I sometimes feel lost in the Trump age. The Republican Party has turned into a very populist party, and sometimes I struggle to see my place in it today. And the reason why I detest populism, right? The reason why I don't like popular uprisings, the reason why I don't necessarily like the idea of the mob just legislating at the ballot box, or the mob using social media to silence a book, or the mob to shame some actor. Who was it that made it? Was it an actor? It was the astronaut. Right? It was the astronaut. Now I'm forgetting his name. Kelly, I think is his last name. He quoted Winston Churchill in a tweet and then got bullied on social media by people who don't like social media, who don't like, I should say Winston Churchill, who think he's a racist, who think he's this awful figure. And he got bullied into apologizing for quoting Winston Churchill, of all people. Ladies and gentlemen, again, that's not the government censoring people. That's not the government intimidating people. That's us. That's each other. What scares me a lot in 2019, what scares me every bit as much as you know, I think the fears we all share about totalitarian government, about government that goes too far, government that silences people. What I worry about in 2019 is how populist we're becoming. Thanks to things like social media, which enable these mobs that I'm talking about that are silencing people. I worry about this all the time. In fact, in the here and now, I'm not so sure that we have more to fear from mobs on Facebook, mobs on Twitter, mobs on the internet in general, forming and coming after people and making people afraid to express themselves, making people afraid to take provocative positions, making people afraid to take unpopular positions. We think about the First Amendment as a law. We think about it as a law that applies to the government. But I think about the First Amendment as being something more than that. The First Amendment is more than just a law that restrains the government. The First Amendment, the spirit of the First Amendment, should be upheld by all of us. I say this often. People who have read my writings for a long time, people who have listened to me for a long time, understand I say this a lot. The price of living in a free society is that sometimes you're going to see and hear things you don't like. That's the price of admission. If you want the right to say what you want, if you want the right to express yourself, if you want the right to live your life the way you want to live it, you're going to have to deal with some people who are doing those things in ways that maybe you don't necessarily approve of. And I think for a long time in America, that's worked imperfectly. We've struggled with it. I could cite you all sorts of examples, but I don't need to because you're familiar with our history. You understand it. You don't need me to cite it. But it's something we've always aspired to. Yet there are times today, as I watch some of this stuff, as I watch an author have to apologize on Twitter for writing a story that's not it's not endorsing slavery, it's not condoning slavery, it's not espousing any sort of racial supremacy over anybody else. All it's doing is placing slavery in a context in terms of skin colors that may be unfamiliar to Americans, given our history, our specific history of slavery. That's all she did, and now she's apologizing for it. Now she's not publishing her book. And I don't really know that much about this author. I don't know much about the book. I don't know if it's going to be a good book or a bad book, but I'll tell you, the idea that an author in the United States of America being bullied into not feeling like she could publish a book because of the people around her, not because of the government, but because as a society, a faction of people have bullied her into this decision. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a shame. That is an ugly, ugly thing. And it's terrifying because, again, it's something that we're doing to ourselves. That's it. My interview with Allan Dickerson coming up next. I've got Allan Dickerson. He's the legal director for the Institute for the Freedom of Speech. And Allan's group has been following the debate over Measure 1 in the state of North Dakota. Now, of course, for those of you who are uninitiated, in 2018, we had a constitutional amendment on the statewide ballot. It was put there by a petition drive. It was approved by the voters, and it did a number of things. It created an ethics commission, but it also directed the legislature to essentially implement new restrictions on things like lobbying, to implement new transparency efforts. I mean, there's a lot of different provisions of the bill, but a number of free speech groups, including the ACLU, including Mr. Dickerson's group, have come out and they have raised some objections to this on constitutional grounds, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, Mr. Dickerson. How are you? And tell us a little bit, what is your group's objection to Measure 1?
Well, first, I'm great. Thank you very much for having me. Second, as to the measure, I think we've got a couple objections, but the major one is that it fails one of the most important tests in regulating political activity, and that's that it just isn't specific enough. It's vague, it's broad, and a normal person trying to engage with his or her neighbors is going to run afoul of it without really meaning to, and that's something what we really worry about in the First Amendment space. Vague,
broad. What do you mean? Give us specifics.
Sure. So the measure kind of sweeps very broadly. Some of the phrases are it requires the legislature to regulate activity to, and this is a quote, influence an election, or even worse, to influence government action. And go as far back as 1976, the Supreme Court in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo specifically said that the phrase "to influence an election" just doesn't give anyone any real guidance. I mean, anything can influence an election. Lower unemployment rates influence the outcomes of elections. Discussions about issues influence the outcomes of elections. And so you can't build, criminal or civil liability around whether or not you're influencing the election, because no one's going to know in advance whether their activity is or isn't covered.
Well, I mean, if we want to get really broad, I mean, if I have a conversation over my back fence with my neighbor about who ought to be elected the local dog catcher, and I convince him to change his vote, I just influenced the election, right?
That's correct. But that's not usually what we think of in campaign finance law.
No, but I mean, if we look at it at an explicit wording of Measure 1, I mean, I think that's we're getting into exactly why overbroad or what the problem is. Now, one argument we've been hearing from a lot of people about this is people saying, well, the voters approved it. Therefore, if the legislature balks at implementing this, they're not abiding by the will of the people, and the legislator ought to just do what they're told. I mean, we're getting a lot of those arguments in North Dakota right now as the legislature begins to grapple this. What would you say to people making that argument?
Well, I have some sympathy for the legislature. In terms of that argument, the simple fact of the matter is you can't undo the First Amendment by passing a ballot initiative. That's just not really an acceptable viewpoint. And more importantly, even if it's true that the people of North Dakota spoke, which I think is true, again, they didn't speak with very much precision. So my favorite topic about this, or my favorite example, is the measure requires the disclosure of the ultimate and true source. That's a phrase of the money that's used in these ways. And I was thinking about that, and sort of what's the ultimate and true source of money spent in an election? I don't think anyone really knows. I think the best answer is probably the Federal Reserve Bank. That can't possibly be what the people of North Dakota intended. So, there's a real interpretive difficulty here where the legislature is trying to implement language that just isn't precise. And simply adopting that imprecise language doesn't really move the ball. That just throws it to the courts. So I don't think that's a very strong objection, both because, again, the constitutional objections are going to be there regardless of what the legislature does. And two, because when the people of North Dakota spoke on this measure, they just didn't do it precisely.
Well, also, I mean, you got to look at the fact that it got a majority, but it didn't get like a huge majority. I think it got like 54, 55% of the vote, which, I mean, that's a majority. It wins. But I mean, it's not like there was a landslide mandate for this either. And also, the voters could do a lot of things. I mean, we could hold a vote and say that there, some government bureaucracy has to approve all news stories before reporters are allowed to publish them. Now, that would be the will of the people, I guess, if we voted for it. It also wouldn't be constitutional. So
that's right.
I think that's an important thing to remember. Now, there are two bills before the legislature. One coming out of the Senate, introduced by State Senator Tim Mathern. The other coming out of the House, and it's a Republican-backed bill. And the one backed by Senator Mathern, I should note that Senator Mathern was actually on the sponsoring committee for Measure 1. So that's sort of the official implementation bill, because this is where it gets a little complicated. Measure 1 obviously becomes law and becomes part of our state constitution, but it also directs the legislature to implement it via statute, which is what the legislature is tasked with now. So sort of the official version of that from the supporters, from Senator Mathern, who is literally on the sponsoring committee, that's in the Senate now. The other one is the Republican bill, and what the supporters of Measure 1 say is, well, the Republican bill waters it all down and makes and it's sort of a half-hearted effort to implement it, and they don't want that one to pass. Now, I assume you've looked at both of these bills. Do you like either of them? I mean, is one better than the other? Should either of them pass in your mind? What's your view on this?
So I've seen the public drafts of them. I think they both sort of suffer from a similar problem, and there's some strengths there as well. I mean, the difficulty, of course, is that, again, if you're going to make the legislation just implement these vague phrases like influence government action, whatever that means, or you have to give the true and ultimate source of the money, whatever that means. You just, that's not, when the people of the people of North Dakota spoke and said implement this legislation, they can't have meant just copy and paste what we wrote in the Constitution into a statute. That doesn't do anything. So in that sense, I think the House version, which does attempt to put some meat on this skeleton, probably is the better legislative approach. But again, it's a very difficult task for the legislature, because they're being asked essentially to implement an unconstitutional state constitutional amendment. And there's only so much they can do to salvage the unconstitutional vagueness and overbreadth in the measure itself.
Now, if I think that's really the problem, because what we're struggling with is that the constitutional language is broad to the point where you and I could come up with all sorts of scenarios, a parade of horribles, if you will, of ways that it could be implemented in keeping with that language. What I hear you saying is that I guess there is a way to implement this in statute that would pass constitutional measure. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I think it's possible. If you were to take the phrase true and ultimate, right? I mean, again, I don't think it can mean or is intended to mean the Federal Reserve Bank, although that would be an accurate answer to the question, what is the true and ultimate source of these funds? That would be true. But it wouldn't really give the people of the state very much information about their politics. So, taking an approach which properly tailors, the sort of funds that are coming in that are actually intended to influence politics, that probably does carry out the will of the people and does it in a way that's constitutional. But notice there's a larger structural problem, which is that the measure doesn't just say we want to know the true and ultimate source of funds used to influence government action, which all of the problems inherent in that. It also says that any individual in the state can sue someone they think has violated this if the state hasn't I think it's fully vindicated the measure. So even if the legislature does everything right, even if they pass somehow, and I'm skeptical this is possible, but even if they find a fully constitutional way to implement this measure, that's not going to be in the end of the story, because now anyone who wants to can come in and sue their ideological opponents or people they don't like, and claim that it hasn't been fully implemented. So it's not just, the legislature isn't going to be the last word on this, because there's obviously going to be people who want to test this out in the courts and want to take issue with the implementation, which is another reason that, the legislature really does have my sympathy on this, because they've been given a really hopeless task.
It's interesting to me when I hear people talk about this. They say, well, we want to get influence out of the government and everything else. And I understand what most people mean when they use words like that. I mean, we're thinking of, moneyed interests, promising lawmakers favors or whining and dining them and getting them to switch their vote or whatever. But there's another perspective of this where you could spend money on politics. You could spend money on running a website. You could spend money on holding rallies. I mean, you could do a lot of things to influence elections, to influence government, and not just the legislature, by the way, but maybe our state industrial commission, which regulates oil and gas development, which is always a hot button issue. I mean, these are regulators. You could lobby them as well. But anyway,
or the courts is filing a brief in court.
Yeah,
that influencing government action.
I guess my point is saying is not all influence in politics is untoward, right? Like if I want. Correct. If I, as a private individual, want to spend money and start it, which I did, actually, it's how I started my career. I spent my own money and I started a blog and lots of people started reading it. And you know what? My opinions and what I had to say and what I uncovered influenced political outcomes in this state. Now, I could tell you I was spending more than $200 a year. Is it fair to put reporting requirements on me and to say that I have to report to the government what I'm spending and what I'm doing and some of these other things that are in here? I think sometimes we talk about influence in politics. We forget it's a democratic society. It's supposed to be the will of the people. How do you express the will of the people without influencing the government?
That's exactly right. It's supposed to be responsive to the people. The people themselves were supposed to be a self-governing republic. And I like your example because it reaches another problem, which is, there's no exception for the press in the measure. It's not impossible to imagine a lawsuit that comes in and says, your blog or even an established paper or a radio program or something along those lines, took a position on some issue, said something about environmental protection or gun rights or fill in the blank, and as a result was influencing government action. And just because the legislature does the right thing and exempts that sort of activity from whatever law comes out, that's not going to stop someone from suing that organization and saying, hey, there's no exception for this. You're influencing the government.
What a lot of people are saying is they're saying, well, hey, ACLU, hey, Rob, hey, whoever, you guys you're all saying that this is unconstitutional. Why don't you just file a lawsuit and sue and just send it straight into the courts? Is that possible, or do we have to wait for the legislature to see how this is going to be implemented? Because I'm not a lawyer. I have no idea. But my thought was maybe a judge isn't going to want to get into it until the legislature implements it. I mean, how does that work?
I mean, it's hard to say because it's very fact dependent. It depends on who's suing. It depends on a lot of things. I do think the cleanest way would be to have some sort of legislation in front of you that you could take to a judge. And again, because this is designed, as far as I can tell, it being the measure to force this into the state courts. I don't think you can just come in and say, yeah, we're so sure that the legislature is gonna mess this up that we've got standing to sue right now. So I mean, it's a technical question, but I do think the cleanest lawsuit and the one that would probably make the courts most comfortable would be one that has, those sort of facts. So you're not just engaging in speculation about how it's going to be enforced.
Now, that leads me to another question from the perspective of North Dakotans who are worried about this and might like to see it taken out of our state constitution by some means. What about the legislature doing a poison pill? What about the lawmakers saying, all right, people, you put this in our constitution. It's unconstitutionally vague, but we're going to give you exactly what you voted for. We're going to take these unconstitutional vague mandates in the Constitution, and we're going to turn them into unconstitutionally vague statutes. And then, we'll wait for the ACLU or the North Dakota Newspaper Association or some other group to sue it and strike it down. I guess that's kind of a poison pill strategy, but I mean, part of me would just like to see that happen. Like, okay, people, you voted for it. Here it is.
I mean, reasonable people, I think, can disagree on this. My own view, for what it's worth, speaking entirely personally, I don't think spite is a particularly good look coming from a legislature towards the population. And I would, the fact of the matter is everyone has to take an oath to the Constitution before they serve in government. I had to take one just to be a member of the bar.
Okay.
And I think passing something to be unconstitutional is kind of problematic.
Yeah. Well, that brings us back to the whole it's the will of the people argument. I don't think that the legislature has a duty to implement the quote-unquote will of the people. if a given lawmaker or a majority of lawmakers, I guess depending on how it breaks down, if they feel it's unconstitutional, right? I mean, to me, that sort of checks and balances the government. Okay, we pass this at the ballot box, but it's got to go through the legislature too. Legislature's going to have their say on it. So I think from that perspective too, that kind of knocks down the whole, well, it's the will of the people, you have to implement it thing.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think that's especially true here, where there's a near certainty that this is going to end up in court if people who pass this measure disagree with that reading of the Constitution. They can go in and say, we actually do think that what we pass is constitutional. I wouldn't like their odds on that, again, since the Supreme Court has specifically said that the phrase to influence an election is unconstitutional. But they can take their chances in court.
I feel like this is going to end in court, because I think earlier, what you said was, you don't see a way for the legislature to pass this that's constitutional. So I think either the supporters of the measure are going to be unhappy with the implementation and they're going to sue, or it's going to be implemented and somebody who thinks their First Amendment rights are being violated is going to sue. And one way or the other, that's where we're going to end up.
I think that's very likely.
Has this happened in another state? Have we seen similar? I mean, is there another place we can look to see maybe what's in store for us?
I can't think of another state that has used language this imprecise. I mean, there have been the fight over exactly what sort of activity is "quote unquote" politics is decades old at this point. But no, I don't know of a similarly overreaching state initiative. So I think we are in a little bit of untraveled waters here. I think the last attempt to reach this broadly was the attempt by the federal government in the 70s after Watergate, and portions of that were struck down, as I was saying.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that this is begging for a challenge.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. This debate, and in fact, one of the groups that backed this measure is called End Citizens United, of course, named after the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, which in and of itself was a challenge to a successful challenge to the McCain-Feingold, campaign finance reform from, I guess, a little more than a decade ago. Where that, in a lot of ways, under the guise of saying, well, we want to get influence out of politics, literally restricted a private group from marketing a film that was critical of Hillary Clinton within so many days of an election. I mean, that's
right. Well, and as you probably know, the first argument for that case, the federal government got up there and said, yeah, no, under the reasoning that we're implying here, the federal government could ban a book that was published by a corporation if it mentioned a candidate.
Yeah. So that to me is amazing. And I think it's a cautionary tale for people who are on this kick of saying, well, let's get big money out of politics. Let's do it. Okay. But if you do that, there's consequences, and it may end up in like film banning or book banning, and yep. Which is frankly un-American. And that's not the America that I want to live in. Allan, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Bringing some
absolutely my pleasure.
Hopefully some clarity to this issue. Thank you.
Of course.
That sad, sad music means that it's the end of another episode of Plain Talk. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday, right away in the morning. As a matter of fact, I scheduled them to come out at 4 o'clock in the morning. So if you're up early, you're doing whatever you're doing, going through your morning routine, you can listen to Plain Talk. You can listen to me rant and rave about the issues of the day and my interviews with newsmakers. If you want to subscribe to the podcast and have new episodes delivered directly to your devices, you could do that if you go to sayanythingblog.com, click the Plain Talk link. You'll find links to subscribe on Spotify, links to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, links to subscribe via Google Play, Google Podcasts, Pocket Cast, all the different services. The RSS feed's there as well if you want to plug it in some way. But that's the way it is. Also, if you want to follow me, you can find me on Facebook. Just search for my name, Rob Port. Be my friend. You could find me on Twitter, also under Rob Port. Say Anything blog is on both Facebook and Twitter. You can find it that way. Links to new episodes are posted in all those places. And hey, if you follow me, say hi, because I like it when people say hi. By the way, if you have feedback, you can also email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. Lots of people who are new to podcasting have been emailing me with some help getting set up. Happy to do that for you. If you have any problems listening to the show, anything that's bothering you, give me some feedback. And if you like something, too, you can tell me if you like things, too. Once again, emails rob@sayanythingblog.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again.